My name is Margaret Ashworth. I am 78 years old. To the world, or what little of it still pays attention, I am a relic. My hands, now knotted with arthritis, are spotted with the brown ink of age. They rest in my lap, quiet and still. Most people who meet me see only a well-preserved old woman, in a silk blouse, a string of pearls at her throat, her memory presumably as faded as the floral pattern on her armchair. They do not see the hands that once held 13 cards with the strategic vision of a 4-star general. They do not know that these hands once executed squeeze plays so elegant they were written about in textbooks. They do not know that for 3 decades, in the hushed, fiercely competitive world of contract bridge, my name was spoken with the same reverence and fear as the grandmasters of chess. I was a life master, a champion, a woman whose mind was a steel trap, capable of remembering every card played in a 52-card deck over the course of a 3-hour game. My late husband, Richard, understood this. He was a brilliant, self-made man who had built a commercial real estate empire from nothing. He was loud, expansive, and saw the world as a series of bold moves and calculated risks. I was his quiet, unassuming partner. But in our private life, and especially over the bridge table, he knew that my mind was the sharper instrument. He admired my ability to see through bluffs, to anticipate unseen hands, to construct a winning strategy from a seemingly random assortment of cards. He used to call me his secret weapon. Richard was a genius at making money, but he was a realist about our family. Our only son, Robert, was a kind, gentle soul, but he had none of his father's fire or my strategic mind. He was a man destined to be managed, not to manage. And Richard knew, with a pragmatism that bordered on brutal, that his grandson, Robert's only child, Ethan, had inherited his grandfather's ambition, but none of his grit. Ethan was born into a world of effortless wealth, a world where the concept of earning something was purely theoretical. He was charming, handsome, and possessed a deep, unshakable sense of entitlement. And so when Richard was diagnosed with a terminal illness, we spent the last year of his life engaged in one final, grand, and incredibly complex bridge hand. The stakes were not points or a trophy, but the entire Ashworth family fortune and, more importantly, my own future security. Richard was determined that the wealth he had spent a lifetime building would not be squandered by the grandson he loved, but did not entirely trust. And he was even more determined that I, his wife, would never be at the mercy of that grandson's whims. Together, with our oldest and most trusted lawyer, we drafted Richard's final will and testament. It was a masterpiece of legal and strategic design. A portion of the estate went to our son, Robert, enough for a comfortable life. But the vast majority, a fortune that ran into the tens of millions, was placed into an ironclad trust. The sole beneficiary of that trust was our grandson, Ethan. But, and it was the most important but of my life, the trust came with a unique and powerful condition, a clause Richard had laughingly called the Grand Dame's Gambit. I called it the Guardian Clause. The clause stipulated that as long as I, Margaret Ashworth, was alive and of sound mind, the trust would be co-managed by myself and the bank. Ethan would receive a generous, but controlled, living allowance. He would have the lifestyle of a wealthy young man, but not the power of one. The key to the vault, the full and complete control of the entire fortune, would only be transferred to Ethan upon one condition: my death, or my legal incapacitation. He could only inherit it all if I was gone, or if I was proven, in a court of law, to have lost the one thing Richard admired most about me, my mind. It was a brilliant, loving, and deeply strategic move. It was Richard's final, grand slam bid. He was protecting his fortune from Ethan's immaturity, and he was protecting me from being seen as a disposable relic. As long as my mind was sharp, I held a vital key to my grandson's future. The contract was my shield. It was Richard's final gift, a testament to his faith not just in my love, but in my intellect. After Richard died, I retired from the world of competitive bridge. The fire, the drive to win, had gone out with him. I settled into a quiet life in the home we had shared for 50 years. I read. I gardened. I played social bridge once a week with a group of old friends. And I watched my grandson, Ethan, grow into the man Richard had predicted he would become. He lived the life the trust afforded him. He drove a sports car. He traveled. He never held a real job. The trust was his identity. He saw the monthly allowance as his salary, and the vast principal as his birthright, an inheritance unjustly held in escrow by his grandmother's stubborn longevity. He met Sophia, a woman as beautiful and as acquisitive as he was. She came from a family with a good name, but dwindling finances, and she saw Ethan as her ticket to the life she felt she deserved. I watched as she fanned the flames of his resentment, whispering in his ear, her words poisonously sweet. They treated me with a kind of cloying, dutiful affection that was transparently false. Their visits were short, their questions about my health a little too pointed, their gazes a little too sharp. They were waiting. They were waiting for me to die, or for my mind to fail. They saw me not as a grandmother, but as a stubborn, outdated lock on the vault that held their future. And their patience, I could sense, was beginning to run out. The public humiliation, the moment they finally showed their hand, came as these things so often do, disguised as a celebration. It was Ethan and Sophia's engagement party. The event was held at a lavish downtown hotel, in a ballroom with soaring ceilings and glittering chandeliers. The cost of the champagne and canapés alone would have been more than my own father's annual salary for most of his life. The room was filled with Sophia's friends and family, a glittering, piranha-like swarm of old money and new ambition. They were all young, beautiful, and possessed a brutal, confident sheen. I, in my modest but elegant Chanel suit, the one Richard had bought me in Paris 20 years ago, felt like a creature from another geological era. I was introduced, with a tight, bright smile from Sophia, as Ethan's grandmother, Margaret. No mention of my past, my accomplishments. I was an ancestor, a fossil presented for inspection. I sat at a small table, nursing a glass of water, observing the scene with the detached, analytical eye of a bridge player. I watched Ethan work the room. He was in his element, charming and confident, his arm possessively around Sophia's waist. He was playing the part of the magnanimous young heir, on the cusp of his great inheritance. The moment of ambush came late in the evening. Ethan and Sophia were holding court with a small, influential circle of Sophia's friends, including a young, aggressive journalist who wrote for a glossy society magazine. I was close enough to hear, a quiet shadow on the edge of their glittering circle. The journalist, a young man with a smirk, turned to Ethan. "So, Ethan," he said, his voice carrying. "Everyone's talking about the Ashworth Trust. That's some serious old-school wealth. You must be excited to finally get your hands on the reins." No. Ethan laughed, a self-deprecating but deeply pleased sound. "Well, you know how these old family trusts are," he said with a conspiratorial wink. "They come with attachments." He glanced over at me, a quick, dismissive flicker of his eyes. "My grandmother, God love her, is the final gatekeeper," he continued, his voice dropping into a tone of fond, pitying concern. "She was a brilliant woman in her day, a real card shark, apparently." The word apparently was a small, sharp knife. He was speaking of my life's work as if it were a rumor, a piece of quaint family folklore. Sophia chimed in, her voice a soft, sympathetic purr. She placed a hand on Ethan's arm. "He's being modest. His grandmother's health has been delicate for some time now. We worry about her constantly. It's a lot for her to manage, all that responsibility." It was a perfectly executed play, a classic pincer movement. They were painting a picture for the journalist, and for everyone else in earshot. A picture of a doting, worried grandson, burdened by the responsibility of a frail, fading grandmother whose mind was no longer what it once was. The journalist took the bait. "So, the transition of the trust is imminent then." And then Ethan played his final, devastating card. He sighed, a deep, theatrical sigh of a man carrying a great and noble weight. He looked around at his rapt audience, his gaze sweeping right past me as if I were a piece of furniture. "We're taking it one day at a time," he said, his voice a masterpiece of feigned sadness. Her mind, well, the lights are on, but nobody's home, if you know what I mean. She has her good days, of course. But mostly, she's just a presence. We have to make all the decisions for her. It's a difficult situation. It's like her body is still here, but her brain is dead. "I'm dead. Buenas." The words, spoken in that hushed, sympathetic tone, were a nuclear bomb detonated in the center of the glittering ballroom. The sound of the string quartet, the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, it all faded away into a dull, roaring silence in my ears. The room seemed to contract, to close in on me. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was not just an insult. It was a public declaration. He was laying the groundwork for the final act. He was telling the world, telling his future allies, that his grandmother was already gone. A mere formality, a legal fiction that would soon be erased. He wasn't just waiting for me to lose my mind. He was actively, publicly, trying to take it from me. For a moment I could not breathe. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it was a physical blow. To be called a burden is one thing. To be dismissed as quaint is another. But to be declared brain dead by the grandson whose every comfort you have funded, in a room full of strangers, that is a wound of a different magnitude. It is the erasure of your very personhood. I looked at his face, flushed with performance and self-pity. I looked at Sophia, her eyes shining with triumph. They thought they had just played the winning card. They thought they had just executed a perfect finesse, trapping the lone queen. But they had made a fatal error, the kind of error an amateur makes against a grandmaster. They had underestimated their opponent. They had forgotten who I was. They saw a frail old woman. They did not see the mind that was, even in that moment of searing pain, calmly, coldly, and with absolute clarity, processing their move, analyzing their strategy, and preparing the devastating counterplay. The mother in me, the grandmother, withered and died in that instant, burned to ash by the heat of his betrayal. But the bridge player, the cold, calculating strategist, the woman Richard had called his secret weapon, she came roaring back to life. I did not storm out. I did not cause a scene. I simply stood there, a ghost at my own execution, and I smiled. It was a small, almost imperceptible smile. And as I looked at my grandson, so proud, so confident, so utterly clueless, I thought of the final, brilliant hidden card that Richard and I had placed in the deck. The guardian clause. The clause he was so certain was a mere formality. The clause that was about to become the instrument of his annihilation. The game was not over. In fact, the final hand had just been dealt. And it was my turn to bid. The sound of polite, sympathetic murmurs washed over me. The sound of the world accepting my grandson's lie. They were buying his performance, hook, line, and sinker. The concerned heir, bravely managing the sad decline of his once brilliant grandmother. I stood on the periphery, a ghost at my own premature funeral, and I felt the searing pain in my chest transform. It was a strange alchemy, the kind a player feels when their opponent makes a catastrophic, game-losing blunder. The pain did not vanish. It transmuted into a substance infinitely harder and more useful, pure, cold, crystalline purpose. He had called me brain dead. In doing so, he had not just insulted me. He had fundamentally misinterpreted the nature of our contract. He saw the guardian clause as a simple statement of fact to be proven, my decline. He failed to see it for what it truly was, a complex, two-way conditional agreement. A bid and a response. He had just made his bid, aggressively and publicly. He had declared me mentally incompetent. He seemed to have forgotten, or more likely never bothered to properly read, the fine print that detailed my response, my counterbid. My mind, the mind he had just declared dead, began to work with a speed and clarity I hadn't felt in years. The competitive fire I thought had been extinguished with Richard's passing roared back to life, fanned by the high, thin air of my grandson's treachery. I was no longer a grieving widow or a doting grandmother. I was Margaret Ashworth, life master, and I had just been challenged to the most important match of my life. The ballroom, with its glittering chandeliers and swarms of chattering people, became a bridge table in my mind. Ethan and Sophia were my opponents. Their lie was their opening play. My secret weapon, as it had always been, was not just my memory, but my ability to see the whole board, to anticipate the flow of the game, to set a trap 3 moves in advance. The Guardian Clause. I could picture the very words on the page, typed in the precise, elegant font of Mr. Davies' law firm. Richard and I had crafted it with the same care we would have used to plan a grand slam. It stated in clear, unambiguous legal language that upon any formal attempt to declare me legally incapacitated, I, Margaret Ashworth, had the right to invoke a contest of competency. This was not just a defense, it was a counteroffensive. The contest was a 2-stage process. The first stage was a comprehensive mental and cognitive evaluation, to be performed not by a simple family doctor, but by a panel of 3 of the top neurological and psychiatric specialists in the country, chosen by a neutral third party, the bank that co-managed the trust. This evaluation was designed to be rigorous, impartial, and utterly definitive. The second stage was the truly brilliant part, Richard's final masterstroke. If the panel of experts found me to be of sound mind, their finding would trigger a secondary clause, the malicious intent provision. This provision stated that any heir who initiated a failed competency challenge would be deemed to have acted with malicious intent to defraud the trust. And the penalty for this was not a slap on the wrist. It was absolute. The heir would be permanently and irrevocably disinherited. Their entire claim on the trust would be nullified, as if they had never existed. The full control of the fortune would then revert solely to me, to dispose of as I saw fit. Ethan, in his arrogant rush to declare me dead, was about to step onto a landmine that he himself had planted. He was trying to open a door, unaware that on the other side was not a vault of gold, but a sheer, bottomless drop. My decision was made in the space of a heartbeat. It was not a decision clouded by anger. It was a decision of pure, cold, beautiful logic. A bridge player does not get angry when an opponent makes a mistake. They capitalize on it. I would not confront him now. I would not cause a scene. A grandmaster never shows their hand until the final, decisive trick. I would let him believe he had won. I would let him bask in the sympathy and admiration he had so cleverly solicited. And then, at the moment of his greatest triumph, I would play my final, devastating card. The party was the perfect venue. It was a public forum, a room full of witnesses. His engagement party, a celebration of his future, would become the stage for its public annihilation. My speech would be my move. It would be my bid, my final, unanswerable contract. I needed to make one phone call, and I needed one ally in the room. I turned away from the glittering circle of my grandson's deceit and drifted through the crowd, a faint, grandmotherly smile fixed on my face. I looked like a slightly lost old woman heading for the powder room. No one paid me any attention. I found a quiet, deserted corridor near the service entrance. I took out my small, simple cell phone. My first call was to my lawyer, Mr. Davies. He was in his 80s, but his mind was as sharp as mine. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp. "Margaret," he said, "I trust you are not enjoying yourself." He knew me well. "Davies," I said, my voice low and clear. "It's time. The gambit has been triggered." Duh. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the faint smile in his voice when he spoke. So, the boy finally overplayed his hand. I knew he would. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to call Judge Harrison, the retired judge who oversees the trust's arbitration matters. I need you to inform him that I am, as of tonight, formally invoking my right to a contest of competency in response to a public declaration of my incapacitation by my grandson, Ethan Ashworth." "Consider it done," Davies said, the satisfaction in his voice palpable. "The bank will be notified first thing in the morning. The process will be set in motion. There's more, I said. I am going to make the announcement public. Tonight, at the engagement party. Another pause. Bold, Margaret. Very bold. A public declaration requires a public response. I approve. I needed one other thing, Davies. I need a witness. A credible one. Someone whose presence here tonight will lend undeniable weight to my presentation. I told him who I needed. He was silent for a moment, then he let out a low chuckle. Perfect, he said. Absolutely perfect. He owes me a favor. He's a 10-minute drive from that hotel. I'll make the call. He'll be there. Thank you, Davies, I said. Godspeed, Margaret, he replied, and hung up. My preparations were complete. The gears were now in motion. I walked back into the ballroom, my heart beating with a slow, steady, powerful rhythm. It was the feeling I used to get just before a major championship match. The adrenaline, the focus, the absolute certainty of my own skill. I felt more alive than I had in a decade. I returned to my table and sat down, a quiet, unassuming old woman once more. I watched Ethan and Sophia, now the center of a laughing, adoring crowd. They were celebrating their victory. They were celebrating their future. They had no idea that their world had already ended. They just hadn't heard the news yet. The rest of the evening unfolded like a slow, deliberate, and exquisitely painful game of cards, where I held all the aces and my opponents thought they were winning with a pair of kings. I watched them, my face a mask of benign, grandmotherly interest, while inside, my mind was a whirlwind of strategic calculation. I was no longer just a spectator. I was the architect of the evening's final, devastating act. The toasts began, as they always do, after the dessert plates were cleared. A succession of young, handsome people stood up to offer slick, pre-packaged sentiments. The best man told a story about Ethan's wild college days. The maid of honor praised Sophia's impeccable taste and fierce loyalty. Each speech was a layer of varnish on the fraudulent masterpiece they called their life together. Ethan and Sophia stood by the head table, their arms linked, their faces glowing. They were drinking in the adoration, the envy, the approval of the room. They glanced at me once or twice, saw me sitting quietly, a forgotten relic at a side table, and the relief on their faces was almost comical. They had successfully managed their grandmother problem. I was silent, just as they had instructed. Then, the final speaker was introduced. It was Sophia's father, a man named Marcus Thorne, a man whose reputation for corporate ruthlessness was legendary. He was a silver-haired shark in a $1,000 suit. He rose to the microphone, and the room fell silent. His speech was not a toast, it was an announcement. He praised his daughter's beauty and his new son-in-law's ambition. Then, he delivered the line that was meant to be the climax of their social coronation. And so, he said, his voice booming through the sound system, it gives me great pleasure to announce not just a marriage, but a partnership. As of next month, Ethan will be joining Thorne and Associates as a junior partner, where he will be instrumental in managing the considerable assets he is soon to inherit. Kind. He was publicly validating Ethan's claim. He was anointing him. He was putting the full weight of his own considerable reputation behind Ethan's story, the story of the brilliant heir taking control. I saw Ethan stand a little taller, his chest puffed out with pride. I saw Sophia look at him with undisguised triumph. This was it. The moment of their absolute victory. The moment my ally arrived. He did not make a grand entrance. A side door opened, and he slipped into the room, a man as out of place in this glittering ballroom as a hawk in a canary cage. He was Dr. Alistair Finch, the most respected and feared neurologist in the country. He was a legend, a man whose expert testimony in competency hearings was considered unassailable. He was also my late husband's oldest friend and our personal physician for 30 years. And as my lawyer Davies had reminded me, he owed me a favor. He caught my eye from across the room and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The final piece was in place. The trap was set. Marcus Thorne finished his speech and raised his glass. To Ethan and Sophia, to the future." The room erupted in applause. People rose to their feet. And in that moment of triumphant noise, I stood up too. My movement, just as before, was quiet, but it cut through the celebratory din. I picked up my water glass. I did not walk to the main microphone. Instead, I walked to the small, intimate space in the center of the dance floor. The applause faltered, then died. The guests, confused, turned to look at me. The band, once again, hesitated. A profound, expectant silence fell upon the room. Thomas and Sophia stared at me, their faces frozen in horror. My son took a step towards me, his mouth opening to say something, to stop me. But I held up a hand, and he froze. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice clear and calm, carrying easily in the sudden hush. "That was a truly illuminating speech, and it brings me to a small piece of family business I feel I must address." I smiled, a warm, grandmotherly smile that was utterly terrifying in its serenity. Some of you heard my grandson, Ethan, mention earlier. There has been some concern about my cognitive health. He has suggested, with great sadness, that I am, in his words, brain dead. A collective gasp went through the room. The directness of the statement was a shocking violation of social norms. I had taken their whispered, insidious campaign and dragged it into the harsh, unforgiving light. "He is, of course, concerned about the Ashworth Trust," I continued, my tone reasonable, almost academic. "He is eager to take full control, as Mr. Thorne just announced. And according to the terms of the trust, he can only do that if I am proven to be legally incapacitated. It is a difficult situation, for all of us." I paused, letting the implications sink in. "For a moment tonight," I said, my voice tinged with a perfect note of feigned vulnerability, hearing my own grandson describe me as a walking ghost. I almost believed him. I began to doubt myself. Is my mind failing? Am I truly gone? Am I truly gone? I let the question hang in the air, allowing the room to fill with a delicious, sympathetic pity for me. "But then I remembered," I said, my voice suddenly sharpening, losing its frail edge and gaining the hard, clear ring of authority, "that my husband and I were bridge players. And we did not believe in leaving things to chance. We believed in contracts. We believed in the rules of the game." I reached into my handbag and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. It was a copy of the Guardian Clause. My grandson seems to have forgotten about the Guardian Clause, specifically the provision for a contest of competency. It states that, should he make a formal attempt to have me declared incompetent, and I believe his public statements here tonight, in front of all of you as witnesses, certainly qualify, I have the right to a definitive, binding medical evaluation. I let my gaze sweep the room, making eye contact with the shocked, captivated faces. "And to that end," I said, my voice ringing with triumph, "I have taken the liberty of inviting a preliminary expert to join us this evening." I turned and gestured to the side of the room. "Dr. Alistair Finch, perhaps you could join me." A new wave of shock rippled through the room as Dr. Finch, his face a mask of grim authority, stepped forward into the light. His name, his reputation, was known to every person of influence in that room. He was not a doctor one called for a simple house visit. He was a doctor one called when millions of dollars and control of an empire were on the line. He walked to my side. He did not look at anyone else. He looked only at me. "Margaret," he said, his voice a low, powerful baritone. "You look as sharp as you did the day you and Richard taught me how to properly execute a grand slam." I smiled at him. "Thank you, Alistair," I said. Then I turned my attention back to my grandson. Ethan was staring at Dr. Finch, as if he were seeing the angel of death himself. Sophia looked like she was going to be physically ill. "So, Ethan, we have a decision to make," I said, my voice now soft, almost conversational, the voice of a player about to lay down the final winning card. "It's your bid. You have publicly declared me incompetent. I am now formally calling your bid." I'm invoking my right to a contest of competency. We will have the panel of experts. We will have the evaluation. Enter. I paused, letting the full weight of the situation settle upon his slumped shoulders. But you must remember the rules of the contract, Ethan. The fine print you never bothered to read. If Dr. Finch and his colleagues find, as I know they will, that my mind is perfectly sound, the malicious intent clause is triggered, and you are permanently and irrevocably disinherited. You lose everything. The trust, the money, the future your fiancé is so eagerly anticipating. No. Well, I wanted. It's your turn. I let that last, venomous little dart find its mark. I saw Sophia flinch. Or, I said, my voice a silken whisper, you can fold, right here, right now. You can stand up in front of all your new important friends, and you can announce that you were mistaken, that you lied, that your grandmother's mind is as sharp as it has ever been. If you do that, I will not invoke the contest. The trust will continue as it is, and you will continue to receive your allowance. I had not raised my voice. I had not shed a tear. I had simply laid out the terms of the contract. I had turned the ballroom into a bridge table, and I had just executed the most devastating squeeze play of my entire life. I had trapped him between public humiliation and financial annihilation. I looked at my grandson, the boy I had loved, the man who had declared me brain dead. His face had crumpled into a mask of pure, abject terror. He looked at Sophia. He looked at her father. He looked at the sea of shocked faces that surrounded him. And he knew, with the sickening certainty of a player who has just been devastatingly and completely outplayed, that he had no winning cards left to play. The game was over, and I had won. The silence that followed my ultimatum was a living entity. It was a perfect, crystalline silence, the kind that exists in the heart of a hurricane. In that silence, every guest in that opulent ballroom became a spectator at the most brutal, high-stakes game they had ever witnessed. It was not a game of cards, but a game of wills, of legacies, of futures, and the entire board was laid bare for them to see. Ethan stood frozen, trapped in the harsh, unforgiving spotlight of my quiet challenge. He was a creature caught in the headlights, his mind, which had always moved so swiftly in the shallow currents of social maneuvering, now utterly paralyzed by the deep, complex strategy that had just ensnared him. He looked from my calm, expectant face to the grim, authoritative figure of Dr. Finch beside me, then to the horrified, furious face of his new fiancée, Sophia, and finally to her father, Marcus Thorne, whose expression was a terrifying thundercloud of rage. I had not given him two bad options. I had given him two forms of annihilation. Option 1, he could admit he lied. In front of this entire assembly of the city's elite, the very people he so desperately wanted to impress, he would have to publicly declare himself a liar and a manipulator. He would have to confess that he had tried to defraud his own grandmother. His reputation would be destroyed. The partnership at Thorne & Associates would evaporate. Sophia, who had attached herself to his future status, would undoubtedly abandon him. He would be a social pariah, but he would keep his allowance. He would remain a wealthy, comfortable, and utterly humiliated man. Option 2, he could call my bluff. He could stand by his claim that I was incompetent and allow the contest to proceed. But it was not a bluff. We both knew it. Dr. Finch's mere presence was a testament to that. The evaluation would be a formality. I would be proven sound of mind, and the malicious intent clause would trigger like a guillotine. He would lose everything. The trust, the allowance, the sports cars, the trips, the entire foundation of his identity. He would be left with nothing but the expensive, useless tuxedo he was standing in. He was checkmated. Or in the language of my world, he was end-played. Every possible move he could make would lead to his own destruction. He began to tremble. A fine, almost imperceptible tremor at first, then a violent, uncontrollable shaking. Sweat beaded on his forehead, plastering his carefully styled hair to his skin. He opened his mouth, but only a dry croaking sound came out. It was Sophia who broke first. Her ambition was a more powerful force than her loyalty. She let go of his arm, as if he were suddenly contagious. Her face, a mask of cold fury, turned on him. "Ethan," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper that somehow carried in the silent room. "Fix this, Nove.Kine." Her command, her public abandonment of him in his moment of crisis, seemed to be the final blow. Ethan's face crumpled. The arrogant, confident air vanished, replaced by a terrified, lost little boy. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a plea that went beyond money, beyond social standing. It was the plea of a child who has just realized he has irreparably broken the one thing he could never replace. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice cracking, the word a ragged admission of defeat. I, but he couldn't say it. He couldn't form the words. He couldn't bring himself to choose his own execution. And so, the decision was made for him. Marcus Thorne, a man who knew how to cut his losses, stepped forward. He did not look at Ethan. He looked at me, a brief, almost imperceptible nod of surrender. Then he took his daughter, Sophia, firmly by the arm and began to steer her away from the head table, away from the wreckage of her engagement. The merger was off. The sight of Sophia being led away, of his entire future walking out the door, finally broke him. Ethan let out a strange, strangled sob. He sank to his knees, his hands covering his face, his body convulsing with the dry, racking sobs of a man who has just lost everything and knows, with absolute certainty, that it is entirely his own fault. The collapse was complete. The party dissolved into chaos. Guests, in a state of shock and delicious scandal, began to leave in droves. The band, seeing their opportunity, finally fled the stage. The beautiful, perfect, and breathtakingly expensive engagement party had become a wake. I stood there for a long moment, watching the scene with the dispassionate eye of a historian observing the fall of an empire. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy. I felt only a profound, hollow, and deeply weary sadness. This was the end game Richard and I had planned for, the one we had prayed would never come to pass. It had worked. The fortress had held. But the cost was the final, absolute loss of the boy I had once loved. Dr. Finch placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Come, Margaret," he said softly. "My work here is done, and so is yours." I let him guide me away from the center of the room, away from the sobbing wreck of my grandson. As we walked towards the exit, guests parted before us as if I were royalty, their eyes a mixture of fear, awe, and pity. I did not acknowledge them. I was already in another place, another time. In the quiet of the hotel lobby, waiting for my car, Dr. Finch turned to me. "Richard would have been proud, Margaret," he said. "That was the most elegant squeeze play I have ever seen." "He would have been heartbroken, Alistair," I replied quietly. "As am I." And in the car on the way home, for the first time that night, I allowed a single silent tear to trace a path down my cheek. It was not a tear of anger or of victory. It was an archivist's tear for a document, a history, a family that was now officially and irrevocably closed. In the aftermath of what the society pages breathlessly dubbed the engagement endgame, my life became very, very quiet. As I had predicted, Ethan chose public humiliation over financial annihilation. The day after the party, a formal, notarized letter of apology, drafted by his new, much cheaper lawyer, was delivered to me and to the bank. In it, he retracted all his statements concerning my mental health and acknowledged that I was, and always had been, of perfectly sound mind. The contest of competency was officially averted. The trust and his allowance remained in place. His social life, however, did not. He became a pariah. The story of his public humiliation, of his grandmother's cold, brilliant, strategic takedown, became the stuff of legend in the circles he so desperately wanted to inhabit. He was no longer the promising heir. He was a joke, a cautionary tale. Sophia, of course, vanished from his life, Her annulment pushed through with ruthless efficiency. Thorne and Associates had no place for a junior partner with such a spectacular lack of judgment. I did not hear from him directly. My son, Robert, called me once, his voice full of a gentle, sorrowful confusion. "I don't understand what happened, Mother," he'd said. "Ethan overplayed his hand, Robert," I had replied. "He made a bad bid, and he lost." It was the only explanation I could give. With the threat to my security removed, a strange and wonderful thing happened. The silence I had been living in since Richard's death began to fill with new possibilities. The competitive fire, the strategic part of my mind that had been reawakened that night, did not want to go dormant again. It wanted a new game to play. I did not want to return to the world of competitive bridge. That world was full of ghosts. But I rediscovered my love for the game itself, for its logic, its beauty, its infinite complexity. I sold the large house we had shared, a house full of memories and sorrows. I bought a beautiful modern penthouse apartment with a panoramic view of the city. In the large, sunlit living room, I installed 4 professional-grade bridge tables. And I opened the Ashworth Bridge Academy. It was not a business, not in the way Innovac was. It was a passion. I started small, offering free lessons to retirees at the local community center. But my reputation, it turned out, had not entirely faded. An article was written about me in the local paper. Life Master offers master classes. And people started to come. Young people, college students, tech entrepreneurs, people who were drawn to the fierce, quiet, intellectual combat of the game. My academy became my new salon. My life, which had become so small and quiet, was suddenly filled with the sound of shuffling cards, of quiet bidding, of lively, intelligent conversation. I taught them the art of the finesse, the strategy of the squeeze play, the importance of seeing the whole board. I was not just their teacher, I was their partner, their mentor, their friend. They did not see a frail old woman. They saw a master of the game, and they treated me with the respect and admiration I had not realized I had been starving for. Ethan's trust continues to pay for his quiet, diminished life. I have no doubt that he is still waiting, hoping that one day he will finally inherit. But he will be waiting a very long time. My mind, exercised daily by the most complex card game ever invented, is sharper than ever. And I am, for the first time in a very long time, profoundly, deeply, and strategically happy. One of my students, a brilliant young woman who is a computer science major at the university, came to me after a class last week. "Margaret," she said, "you always say that the most important thing in bridge is to know what you hold in your own hand. But I think the real lesson you teach is to never, ever let your opponent define your worth." I smiled. She had learned the lesson well. I had spent a lifetime mastering the art of the game, but the final, most important hand I ever played was not for a trophy or a title. It was for myself. It was a game to reclaim my own mind, my own dignity, my own story. And it was a grand slam.